Here we're going to look at Java for loops and while loops, assuming you know some Python. Okay, so maybe obviously we need loops. Like here I've got some Java code that prints the numbers 1 to 13. And if you were designing a programming language, you'd be like, this cannot be the easiest way to do this. So take a second to look at this Python code, maybe pause the video. Okay, so here's a solution. I like to think of Java thinking, that's not enough characters. So let's look at that same thing, but in Java. Here's the Python. Okay, so here's the Java, and I've grayed out a bunch of the stuff that we're going to ignore for right now. So it's inside of a class, and then we've written it in a main method. The main method is what runs when you run the class, but we're going to ignore that for now and just focus on the while loop. Okay, so here they are side by side, and I want you to think about what the differences are. I want you to think about learning a new programming language, once you already know one, as a little bit like knowing how to print and then learning cursive. When you're learning cursive, you have to pay a lot of attention to the specifics of how different letters are drawn and how that's different than printing. And some of it's going to seem really intuitive and some of it's going to seem super bizarre. I think one of the bizarre pieces is in Python we just get to say print. And in Java we have to say system.out.println. So imagine I gave you some print on the top and some cursive on the bottom. Looking at the differences might help you start to develop the patterns to try and understand and be able to eventually write in cursive. Okay, so I'll assume you've noticed some of the differences in the code here. I want to draw your attention to some specific ones. So in Python, when we created the variable count, we didn't have to specify the type of it, but in Java, we have to say that it's of type int. And so we put int in front of declaration of variables holding numbers, and we put a semicolon after that variable assignment. You'll notice the only difference with the while loop is that we use a colon or a curly brace, and again, the print looks pretty different. I'll also draw your attention to the fact that both of them just say count gets or equals count plus 1. Okay, so in the Java, we've got a semicolon after it, but those lines look basically the same. And so here I want you to notice that when you're using the variable count, you don't have to put the int in front of it. We just put the int, or whatever type we want that variable to be, in front of variables when we're first defining them. Later when we use them, we don't put it, and actually can't put it. Java would be confused because it would be like, are you trying to redefine a new variable named count? But you already got one. So I just mentioned why we didn't put int in front of that line in Java. And I want to point out that also this line count gets or equals, so count gets the new value of count plus 1, we could have replaced it with count plus plus or count plus equals 1. All those would be the same. So you've probably written a bunch of while loops, and I just want to motivate the next thing we're going to talk about, which is for loops, by saying, have you ever forgotten that line, count equals or count gets count plus 1? Like for sure, you have forgotten that. It's just super common. So with for loops, they're going to try and help us make sure we remember that piece to update this variable that we're using in our while condition. So on the top, I've got a while loop in Java, and on the bottom, I've got for loop in Java. And check it out, all the pieces are still here, but actually I think the order of the pieces is pretty unintuitive. So here I want to draw your attention to the center box. So A is our initialization in a while loop, but in our for loop, that's the first thing there. So that initialization goes before the first semicolon in those parentheses. Then B is our condition. If B is true, then we're going to execute the loop body. If B is false, then we're going to go to the line after the while loop ends, so after that curly brace. And our for loop, that's the second piece. That's the thing after the first semicolon. So if B is true, then it's going to do the loop body. And the big idea with the loop body is that's D. So that's the real work that we want to do. But to make our while loop work, we need that piece like count gets count plus 1. We need that piece so that the condition in our while will change. Eventually count will equal 1 million, so that B will be false. And then we go to just below the while loop end, so just after that curly brace. So A is typically referred to as the initialization, B is our condition, and C is typically referred to as our increment. It doesn't always have to be incrementing, but that's the basic idea, and then D is our loop body. So I'd hope that even just with this slide, you could translate any for loop into a while loop and any while loop into a for loop. And I want you to recognize that like the for loop syntax might be a little bit less intuitive, but it's going to be helpful for making sure we don't forget that C piece, which is that increment. So as a bit of practice, you could pause and try and translate this while loop into a for loop. So pause it. Here's the solution. As a little extra practice, you could pause it and try and translate this set of for loops into 2 while loops. So pause it here. Here's the solution. It really is just rearranging it from a for loop to a while loop, but I think this one's a little bit trickier because of the nesting. So I want to draw your attention to the fact that for every value of apple, we do that inner for loop with banana. And so every time we're going to start that loop, we have to reset banana to 7. And as an exercise, you might imagine trying to scramble some of these lines. Like, what if I moved banana plus plus down with apple minus minus? What would happen then?